The sun was setting over Silicon Valley as Thomas Sterling stood at his office window, 40 stories above the bustling streets of San Francisco. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his early 40s, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, with slight touches of gray at his temples that somehow made him look even more distinguished. The view from his office was breathtaking, but he barely noticed it anymore. Success had become his normal, and sometimes he wondered if that was part of the problem. On his desk sat the latest Forbes magazine with his face on the cover, Tech's Golden Boy, How Thomas Sterling Built a $50 billion Empire from a Garage Startup. The article praised his journey from a college dropout coding in his parents' garage to becoming one of the youngest tech billionaires in history. What the article didn't mention was how empty his massive house felt when he came home late at night, or how he and his wife Catherine barely spoke anymore beyond discussing their social obligations. Catherine. He let out a deep sigh as he thought about her. They had met in college, back when he was just a passionate kid with big dreams and a broken laptop. She had believed in him when nobody else did, spent countless nights helping him perfect his pitches, and stood by him through 3 failed startups before Stream Connect finally took off. Now, 15 years later, they lived like polite strangers sharing a luxury mansion. "Mr. Sterling?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your car is ready to take you to the airport. The private jet is fueled and waiting." Thomas grabbed his carry-on bag. He never bothered with large suitcases anymore. Everything he needed could be bought wherever he landed. This time it was Singapore for the Asian Tech Summit, where he was delivering the keynote speech. Just another week away from home, though home hadn't felt like home for quite some time. The flight to Singapore was smooth, filled with the usual routine of reviewing presentations and answering emails. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the recent board meeting where someone mentioned his company was starting to look too traditional compared to newer startups. The comment had stuck with him, needling at his pride. The summit was being held at Marina Bay Sands, and Thomas couldn't help but appreciate the irony of how the building's architecture reflected his own life, impressive from the outside, hollow in the middle. He walked through the crowded conference hall, nodding at familiar faces and sharing quick handshakes. Everyone wanted a piece of his time, a moment of his attention, a chance to pitch their ideas. It was exhausting. That's when he saw her. Maria Chen was leading a presentation on AI ethics in the smaller conference room, but there was nothing small about her presence. At 28, she commanded the room with a confidence that reminded Thomas of himself at that age. Her presentation wasn't just about code and algorithms. She spoke about the human impact of technology, the responsibility they had to build systems that helped people rather than just generating profits. Thomas found himself slipping into the back of the room, something he hadn't done at a conference in years. Usually, he only attended the main events where he was speaking. But Marina's voice caught him, clear, passionate, and refreshingly honest. When she talked about the problems with current AI systems, she didn't sugarcoat the issues. She called out specific companies, including his own, but her criticism wasn't malicious. It was constructive, innovative, and backed by solid research. During the Q&A of the session, Thomas raised his hand. Another thing he hadn't done in years. The surprise on people's faces when they realized who was asking the question was evident, but Marina didn't flinch. She addressed his challenging question about implementation costs with a brilliant breakdown of long-term savings and social benefits. For the first time in years, Thomas felt intellectually stimulated. After the session, he approached her, expecting the usual starstruck reaction he got from younger tech professionals. Instead, Marina gave him a warm but measured smile. "Mr. Sterling, I was hoping you'd be here. I have some thoughts about Stream Connect's new neural network architecture that I think you should hear." They ended up talking for hours in the hotel's rooftop restaurant. Marina ordered simple noodles instead of the expensive seafood everyone usually chose when dining with him. She spoke with her hands, her eyes lit up when discussing new ideas, and she wasn't afraid to tell him when she thought he was wrong. It was refreshing. No one had challenged him like this in years. Thomas found himself sharing things he hadn't told anyone, his fears about becoming obsolete in the industry he helped build, his worry that Stream Connect was losing its innovative edge, his feeling of being trapped in a golden cage of his own making. Marina listened without judgment, then proceeded to challenge every assumption he'd made about his situation. "The problem isn't that you're becoming obsolete," she said, using her chopsticks to emphasize her point. "It's that you've surrounded yourself with people who are afraid to tell you when you're wrong. When was the last time someone in your company actually disagreed with you in a meeting?" The question hit him like a bucket of cold water. He couldn't remember. As the Singapore skyline glittered around them, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the excitement of possibility. Marina's ideas about AI development weren't just innovative, they were revolutionary. She showed him preliminary code on her laptop, walking him through her vision of how technology could be more intuitive, more human. The conference was supposed to last 3 days. Thomas attended every one of Marina's sessions, rearranging his schedule and even skipping a major panel where he was supposed to speak. His assistant was horrified, but Thomas didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt alive, engaged, excited about the future of technology again. On the last night of the conference, as they walked through the gardens by the bay, Marina turned to him. "You know what your company's problem is. You've forgotten why you started coding in the first place. It was never about the money for you, was it? It was about creating something that could change people's lives." Thomas stopped walking, struck by the truth in her words. He had started coding because he wanted to create something meaningful, something that could connect people across distances. Somewhere along the way, among the board meetings and profit margins and stockholder obligations, he'd lost sight of that original dream. The realization left him feeling both liberated and terrified. His life looked perfect on paper: the billion-dollar company, the mansion in Silicon Valley, the supermodel wife, the magazine covers. But standing there in the warm Singapore night, talking to someone who reminded him of everything he used to be, Thomas couldn't ignore the emptiness anymore. His phone buzzed, another message from Catherine about some charity gala they were supposed to attend next week. He stared at the screen, remembering how they used to stay up late dreaming about changing the world. Now they mostly talked about maintaining appearances. When had they stopped sharing their real dreams with each other? Marina was still talking about her ideas for ethical AI development, her words full of the same passion he once had. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something he thought he'd lost years ago: hope. Hope that maybe it wasn't too late to rediscover his passion for innovation, to remember why he fell in love with technology in the first place. What he didn't realize as he stood there in the gardens with Marina was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would completely transform his life. The perfect life he had built was about to unravel, but sometimes things need to fall apart before they can be rebuilt into something real. The first photos appeared on a quiet Tuesday morning. Thomas was in a board meeting when his phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications. At first, he ignored them. Being a tech billionaire meant his name regularly appeared in the news. But when his assistant rushed in, face pale and tablet in hand, he knew something was different. There they were, splashed across every major news website. Photos of him and Marina walking hand in hand along a pristine beach in the Maldives. The headlines were brutal: "Tech Titan's Secret Paradise Getaway, Sterling's Young Love. Inside the billion-dollar betrayal." The private moments he'd shared with Marina over the past 3 months had become public fodder. The board meeting came to an abrupt halt. The room, with its polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco Bay, suddenly felt suffocating. Thomas loosened his tie, something he never did in business settings. One of the board members, an elderly gentleman who'd known him since his startup days, just shook his head in disappointment. "We need to get ahead of this," his PR team insisted, already gathering in the conference room next door. They spoke about damage control, about protecting the company's image, about releasing statements that would minimize the impact. But Thomas barely heard them. His thoughts were with Catherine, who would be waking up to this news at their home. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. That's when he saw her Instagram post, the first one she'd made in months. It was a photo from their wedding day, 15 years ago. They looked so young, so in love, so full of dreams. Her caption was simple but devastating: "Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us deepest." The post went viral within minutes. #Team Catherine started trending on Twitter. Comments flooded in, most of them condemning Thomas. The same public that had once celebrated his success now seemed eager to tear him down. The narrative was simple and compelling: the wealthy tech mogul who abandoned his loyal wife for a younger woman. But they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know about the quiet dinners he and Marina had shared, talking about everything from quantum computing to their childhood dreams. They didn't know how she challenged his ideas, pushed him to be better, reminded him of the innovator he used to be. They didn't know about the nights he and Catherine had spent in separate wings of their mansion, their marriage existing mainly for public appearances. The paparazzi descended like vultures. They camped outside his office, his house, even his favorite coffee shop. Every move he made became news. When he tried to enter his own home to talk to Catherine, photographers nearly knocked him over in their rush to get the perfect shot of the guilty husband returning to the scene. Catherine had shut herself away, communicating only through her lawyers. Their text exchanges, once filled with mundane discussions about social events and house maintenance, now consisted solely of legal jargon. The warmth that had once existed between them, even if only in friendship, had frozen completely. Marina was struggling too. As a private person who'd built her career on her brilliant mind, suddenly being known as the other woman was devastating. Tech forums that had once praised her innovative AI research now filled with personal attacks and speculation about her motives. Was she a gold digger? A homewrecker? The comments grew increasingly vicious. "I never wanted any of this," she told Thomas during a late-night video call, her eyes red from crying. She was in Singapore, where local media had been camping outside her apartment. "My research grant is being reviewed. The university is reconsidering my position. Everything I've worked for." Thomas felt helpless. His wealth, which had always solved problems before, seemed useless now. He couldn't buy back their privacy or protect Marina's reputation. He couldn't fix Catherine's broken trust or silence the judging voices of millions of strangers who thought they knew their story. The company's stock took a hit as some investors worried about moral leadership. Board members started having private conversations about whether he should step down temporarily. His phone filled with messages from people either offering support or expressing their disappointment. Many were from old friends who'd been at his and Catherine's wedding. One message stood out. It was from his mother, who rarely interfered in his life anymore. "I raised you to be honest, Thomas. If you love this woman, then face the consequences of your choices with dignity. But if this is just a midlife crisis, end it now before you hurt more people." Her words forced him to confront the reality of his situation. He'd known the affair would eventually come to light. He wasn't naive. But he'd underestimated the collateral damage. Catherine's pain, Marina's suffering, the company's stability, his reputation, everything was unraveling faster than he could process. The media painted their story like a soap opera, but the reality was far more complex. There were no villains, just three people whose lives had become painfully intertwined. Catherine wasn't just the wronged wife, she was a woman who'd lost her way in their marriage too, though no one talked about that. Marina wasn't a home wrecker, she was a brilliant professional whose work might now be overshadowed by scandal. And Thomas? The public saw him as the wealthy man having a midlife crisis, but he felt more real, more alive, more himself than he had in years. The question was that feeling worth the price they were all paying? The breaking point came when Catherine finally agreed to meet him, not at their house, but at their old favorite coffee shop. The place where they'd spent countless hours during his startup days, where she encouraged him when investors said his ideas were too ambitious. Now they sat across from each other like strangers, their untouched coffees growing cold between them. "I don't hate you," Catherine said, her voice steady but quiet. "I think that's what makes this harder. We both let this marriage die long before Marina came along. We just didn't have the courage to admit it." Her words, freed from the bitterness he'd expected, hit him harder than any angry accusation could have. They talked for hours, really talked, for the first time in years. About where they'd gone wrong, about the dreams they'd lost sight of, about the people they'd become. As he left the coffee shop, Thomas knew their conversation would soon be twisted by gossip sites and social media. But for the first time since the scandal broke, he felt something like peace. The perfect life he'd maintained for so long had been a beautiful glass house, and now that it had shattered, he could finally step out of it and breathe. The divorce papers were signed on a rainy morning in San Francisco. Thomas and Catherine met one last time in their lawyer's office, both trying to maintain their composure as they ended 15 years of marriage. The proceedings were surprisingly peaceful. Catherine had refused to drag things out in court despite her lawyers pushing for a more aggressive settlement. "I want to move forward, not get stuck in bitterness," she'd said, and Thomas felt a renewed respect for the woman he'd once loved. The media painted her as a victim, but she was proving to be much stronger than anyone expected. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a small private garden in Kyoto, exchanging vows with Marina. The ceremony was intimate, with only 10 guests present, a stark contrast to his lavish first wedding. Marina wore a simple white dress that made her look radiant, and when she squeezed his hand during their vows, Thomas felt certain about his choice despite all the chaos it had caused. But the real challenges began after the honeymoon. Back in Silicon Valley, the tech community had largely turned its back on Thomas. Former friends suddenly became too busy for meetings. Speaking invitations dried up. Even some of his most loyal employees started jumping ship to competitors. "Don't let it bother you," Marina would say, her optimism unwavering. She'd set up a small AI research firm, refusing to use any of Thomas's connections or money. "We're building something new, something that matters. The rest will follow." Thomas admired her resilience. Despite the harsh judgments and whispers that followed her everywhere, Marina threw herself into her work. She was developing an AI system that could help detect early signs of depression in teenagers through social media patterns, the kind of meaningful project that reminded Thomas why he'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. Meanwhile, Catherine had surprised everyone by channeling her experience into something powerful. She founded New Chapter, a non-profit organization supporting women going through major life transitions. The press loved it, the wronged wife turning her pain into purpose. But Thomas knew it was more than just good PR. Catherine had found her calling, something she'd been searching for throughout their marriage. One evening, as Thomas scrolled through news about Catherine's latest project, a scholarship program for women returning to work after divorce, Marina touched his arm gently. "She's doing amazing things," she said. "Sometimes the end of one story is necessary for another to begin." The tech industry's cold shoulder was hitting Thomas's company hard. Stream Connect's stock had dropped 30% since the scandal. Young tech talents, once eager to work for him, now saw his company as outdated, tainted by controversy. Board meetings became increasingly tense as investors demanded changes. "Maybe it's time to step back," one board member suggested during a particularly difficult meeting. "Let someone else be the face of the company for a while. Someone less controversial." The suggestion stung, but Thomas couldn't deny its logic. His personal choices had affected thousands of employees who depended on Stream Connect for their livelihoods. That night, he sat in his home office until dawn, thinking about responsibility and consequences. Marina found him there, still in his suit from the day before. Without a word, she pulled up a chair and opened her laptop. "Let me show you something," she said, pulling up the code for her latest project. "I think this could help Stream Connect reconnect with its original mission." They worked together through the morning, Marina's fresh perspective helping Thomas see new possibilities for his company. Her understanding of AI ethics and human-centered design offered a path forward that excited him more than anything had in years. But not everyone was thrilled about their collaboration. Tech blogs started running stories about conflict of interest and nepotism. When Stream Connect announced a new AI initiative incorporating some of Marina's ideas, the backlash was immediate. Comments flooded in about how Thomas was compromising the company's integrity for his new wife. The criticism hurt Marina more than she let on. One night, Thomas found her crying in their kitchen, clutching her phone. Someone had created a fake profile using her university photo, posting made-up stories about how she'd manipulated her way into the tech world. "I just wanted to make something meaningful," she whispered. "Why can't they see that?" Thomas held her close, feeling a mix of love and guilt. His wealth and status, which he thought would protect them, had instead made them bigger targets. Marina's brilliant mind was being overlooked because of their relationship, and he didn't know how to fix it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Catherine gave an interview about her nonprofit work, and when asked about Thomas and Marina, she said something that changed the narrative. "It's easy to judge from the outside, But life isn't black and white. They're both brilliant minds in tech. Maybe instead of focusing on their personal lives, we should pay attention to the innovations they're trying to create. Her words, coming from such an unexpected source, shifted something in the industry's perception. Slowly, people began looking at Marina's work on its own merits. Her AI depression detection system gained attention from major mental health organizations. Even some of StreamConnect's departed employees started reaching out, interested in the company's new direction. Thomas and Marina celebrated small victories together: a successful project launch, a positive article about their work, a partnership with a major healthcare provider. They had dinner at home most nights, talking about code and dreams and the future, building the kind of genuine partnership Thomas had always wanted but never quite achieved in his first marriage. One evening, as they walked along the beach near their home, Marina stopped and turned to Thomas. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "All the chaos we caused, the price we paid?" Thomas thought about the past year, the lost friends, the business struggles, the public criticism. But he also thought about the meaning he'd found in his work again, the genuine connection he shared with Marina, and even the unexpected growth that had come from the pain they'd caused. "I regret hurting people," he said finally. "But I don't regret choosing truth over pretense. Sometimes the hardest choices lead us where we need to be." Marina squeezed his hand, and they continued their walk as the sun set over the Pacific. Their story wasn't the fairy tale some might have expected from a billionaire's romance, but it was real. And sometimes, real was better than perfect. The morning Marina disappeared started like any other. Thomas woke up early for a board meeting, kissed his sleeping wife goodbye, and left their beachside home in his Tesla. Everything seemed normal. Her coffee cup was in the sink, her laptop was on her desk, and her favorite sweater was draped over the kitchen chair. It wasn't until he came home that evening that he noticed something was wrong. The house was dark and quiet, too quiet. Marina's car was still in the garage, but she wasn't in any of her usual spots. Not in her home office, not in the garden where she liked to work on sunny days, not in their bedroom reading as she often did. That's when he saw the note on their bedroom dresser, written in her neat handwriting. "I need some time to think. Please don't look for me. I'm safe, Marina." At first, Thomas thought it was a joke, or maybe she'd just gone for a walk to clear her head. But as hours turned into days, reality began to sink in. Marina had vanished, taking only her passport, some clothes, and her personal laptop. She'd left her work computer, her credit cards, even her beloved collection of rare programming books. The police were surprisingly unhelpful. "Sir," the detective said, looking uncomfortable in Thomas's expensive living room, "your wife is an adult who left of her own free will. She said she's safe. Unless we have reason to believe she's in danger, there's not much we can do." The media, which had finally started to lose interest in their story, pounced on the news with renewed vigor. Tech billionaire's young wife vanishes. Trophy wife takes off. Sterling scandal, the final chapter. The headlines grew more sensational by the day. Thomas's friends, the few who'd stuck by him through the scandal, tried to help. They hired private investigators, checked airport footage, traced her last known movements. But Marina had been clever. She'd withdrawn cash gradually over several months, used no traceable cards, and somehow managed to disappear completely in an age where privacy seemed impossible. Late at night, alone in their big house, Thomas would replay their last conversations in his mind, looking for clues he might have missed. Marina had been quieter than usual in the weeks before she left, spending more time in their home office. He'd assumed she was focused on her AI project, but now he wondered if she'd been planning her departure all along. The last real conversation they'd had was about having children. Marina had seemed distracted, almost nervous. "What if we're not ready?" she'd asked. "What if we've moved too fast?" Thomas had brushed off her concerns, telling her they had plenty of time to figure things out. Now those words haunted him. StreamConnect's stock took another hit as rumors spread about why Marina had left. Some suggested she'd stolen company secrets. Others claimed she'd never loved Thomas at all, that she'd been a corporate spy all along. The board members who'd finally started to accept her now looked at Thomas with renewed suspicion. "Maybe this is for the best," one board member suggested during a crisis meeting. "The company needs stability, Thomas. Your personal life has been distracting." But Thomas couldn't focus on the company. For the first time in his life, his work felt meaningless. He spent his evenings walking along the beach where they used to talk about their dreams, visiting the coffee shop where she'd sketch out her AI algorithms on napkins, sitting in her office surrounded by the books and notes she'd left behind. Catherine, surprisingly, reached out to him. They met at their old coffee shop, where she found him staring into a cold cup of coffee. "I know that look," she said softly. "It's how I felt when you left." Her words weren't meant to hurt him, but they made him understand, finally and completely, the pain he caused her. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, his voice rough. "And now, I don't even know what happened. Did I push her away? Did I miss something important?" Catherine shook her head. "Sometimes people leave because they need to, Thomas. It's not always about what someone else did wrong." The tech community buzzed with theories. Some suggested Marina had been working with a competitor, others claimed she'd gone back to Singapore. A few cruel voices suggested she'd found another wealthy man. Thomas ignored them all, focusing instead on the small details that made no sense. Like how she'd left her favorite coffee mug in the dishwasher, as if planning to use it the next morning. Or how her research notes were still spread out on her desk, complex AI algorithms half completed. People running away usually cleaned up after themselves, didn't they? Then there were the odd changes he'd noticed in her behavior during those last few weeks. The long phone calls she'd take in the garden, speaking too quietly for him to hear. The way she'd stopped going to her favorite yoga class, claiming she was too tired. The strange questions she'd asked about their future, about family, about what really mattered in life. 3 months into her disappearance, Thomas made a discovery that shook him. Going through their home office, he found a hidden folder in her desk. Inside were printouts of medical test results dating back several weeks before she left. His hands trembled as he read them, pieces of the puzzle finally starting to come together. But before he could process what he'd found, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple: "The cherry blossoms are beautiful in Vancouver this spring." It was their private joke. Marina had always wanted to see Vancouver's cherry blossoms, claiming they were even more beautiful than the ones in Japan. Thomas stared at the message for a long time, his heart racing. Was it a clue? A goodbye? A request? That night, he sat on their bedroom balcony, watching the waves crash against the shore. The house felt different now, filled with questions instead of answers. The life he built, lost, rebuilt, and lost again seemed like a complex algorithm he couldn't quite solve. Marina's note still sat on his dresser. "I need some time to think." Maybe, he thought, looking at the medical records in his hands, she had more reasons for leaving than he'd understood. The question was, what was he supposed to do with this information? As the sun set over the Pacific, Thomas made a decision. Sometimes, he realized, love meant respecting someone's need for space, even when every instinct screamed to chase after them. Marina had asked him not to look for her. Maybe the most loving thing he could do was honor that request, trust that she had her reasons, and hope that someday she'd be ready to share them with him. 3 years had changed Thomas in ways he never expected. The aggressive, always-in-control tech titan had mellowed into someone quieter, more thoughtful. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at Stream Connect, focusing instead on charitable work and mentoring young entrepreneurs. His new office was half the size of his old one, but somehow he felt more comfortable there. That spring morning, he was in Vancouver for a tech education conference. He'd almost declined the invitation. Public speaking wasn't his priority anymore, but something about the city's name on the invitation made him pause. Maybe it was because of that last text about cherry blossoms, or maybe it was just time for a change of scenery. The conference had ended early, and Thomas found himself walking through Stanley Park. The cherry blossoms were indeed beautiful, just as Marina had always imagined they would be. Pink petals drifted through the air like snow, covering the pathways in a delicate carpet. He'd heard the children's laughter before he saw them. The playground was full of the usual weekend crowd, parents watching their little ones climb and swing and slide. Thomas often found himself watching families these days, wondering about the life he might have had. That's when he saw her. Marina was sitting on a bench near the sandbox, looking both different and exactly the same. Her hair was shorter now, and she wore simple jeans and a sweater instead of her usual tech executive attire. But it was the sight of the children around her that made Thomas freeze in his tracks. 4 toddlers, identical in size but dressed in different colored outfits, played in the sand before her. 2 little boys and 2 little girls, all with dark hair and familiar features that make his heart stop. They looked about 2 years old, and they looked exactly like him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas gripped a nearby tree for support, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The medical reports he'd found, her sudden disappearance, her request for space, everything suddenly made a different kind of sense. One of the little girls looked up then, her eyes meeting his across the playground. She smiled, his own smile, the one he saw in photos and magazine covers, and waved enthusiastically. Marina followed her daughter's gaze, and time seemed to stop as their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of the playground faded away, the squealing children, the chattering parents, the distant traffic. Everything disappeared except for Marina and those 4 beautiful children. Marina spoke first, her voice steady but soft. "I wondered if you'd ever find us here." The children, noticing their mother's distraction, turned to look at Thomas. They were mirror images of each other, 2 boys with curious expressions, 2 girls with friendly smiles. All 4 had his eyes and Marina's nose, a perfect blend of their features. "Leo, Lucas, Luna, and Lily," Marina said quietly, answering his unspoken question. "There'll be 3 in August." Thomas felt his legs move without conscious thought, carrying him closer to the family he hadn't known he had. The toddlers watched him approach with innocent curiosity. One of the boys, Leo or Lucas, he wasn't sure which, held up a plastic shovel in offering. "Would you like to help us build a castle?" the little boy asked, his voice clear and confident, so much like Thomas's own. Thomas sank onto the sand, accepting the shovel with trembling hands. The children immediately included him in their play, chattering away about moats and towers and dragons, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake happening between the adults. "I found the medical reports," Thomas said softly, helping one of the girls, Luna, he learned, pack sand into a bucket. "After you left, but I never imagined." "Quadruplets," Marina finished for him. "High-risk pregnancy. The doctors said it was extremely rare, especially since we weren't using any fertility treatments." She watched the children play, a soft smile on her face. "I was terrified. Not just of the pregnancy, but of everything. The media attention, the pressure, the scrutiny these babies would face before they were even born." One of the little boys climbed into Thomas's lap, completely at ease with this stranger who looked so much like him. "Daddy?" he asked simply, touching Thomas's face with sandy fingers. The word hit Thomas like a physical blow. Marina had clearly told them about him. There was no hesitation in the children's acceptance of his presence, no fear of this unknown man who'd appeared in their playground. "Yes, Lucas," Marina said gently. "This is your daddy." The other children crowded around then, full of questions and observations. "You're tall like in the pictures. Do you really make computers? Can you push me on the swing?" Their voices overlapped, eager and innocent, and completely unaware of the complex adult world that had kept them apart. Thomas looked at Marina over the children's heads, trying to process everything. "Why now?" he asked. "Why here?" She watched as Lily showed Thomas her favorite stuffed bunny, her expression thoughtful. "They've been asking about you more and more. I've shown them pictures, told them stories. They know you create things that help people, that you live by the ocean, that you love solving puzzles just like they do." She paused, brushing a cherry blossom petal from Luna's hair. "I realized I couldn't keep them from their father forever. It wasn't fair to them, or to you." The afternoon slipped away as Thomas got to know his children. He learned that Leo was the quiet thinker, Lucas the bold adventurer, Luna the peacemaker, and Lily the natural leader. They worked together to build an elaborate sandcastle, complete with a moat and bridges made of twigs. Other parents at the playground gave them curious looks, perhaps recognizing Thomas from the news, or simply noticing the striking resemblance between father and children. But for once in his life, Thomas didn't care about being recognized. As the sun began to set and the spring air grew cooler, the children began to tire. They leaned against Thomas and Marina, yawning and rubbing their eyes. Thomas felt an overwhelming surge of love for these 4 little people who had his smile, his eyes, his curious nature. We should get them home, Marina said, standing up and brushing sand from her jeans. Then, after a moment's hesitation, would you like to come with us? There's so much more to tell you, and they'll want to show you their rooms, their toys, their whole world. Thomas looked at his children, and felt tears prick at his eyes. The past 3 years of emptiness and questioning suddenly felt worth it, knowing they had led him to this moment. Yes, he said simply, lifting a sleepy Luna into his arms while Marina gathered Lily. I'd like that very much. As they walked through the park, cherry blossoms still falling around them like pink snow, Thomas realized that sometimes life's biggest gifts came disguised as its greatest losses. He had 4 beautiful reasons to be thankful for Marina's disappearance, even if the pain of those 3 years would always be part of their story. Marina's home was a cozy 2-story house in a quiet Vancouver suburb, with a garden full of children's toys and a tire swing hanging from a massive maple tree. As they walked through the door, the quadruplets immediately came alive again, eager to show their father everything. Look at my drawings. See my robot. I can read this book. Want to see my collection? Their excited voices filled the house as they pulled Thomas in 4 different directions at once. Marina watched with a gentle smile, letting them have their moment before announcing it was bedtime. The nighttime routine was a well-orchestrated dance. Each child needed their own special tucking in, their own bedtime story, their own special goodnight kiss. Thomas watched in amazement as Marina handled it all with practiced ease, his heart aching for all the bedtimes he'd missed. Finally, with 4 sleepy toddlers safely in their beds, Marina and Thomas sat in the kitchen. She made tea, just like she used to in their Silicon Valley home, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks before I left, Marina began, wrapping her hands around her mug. I've been feeling strange for a while, but I thought it was just stress from all the public attention. When the doctor told me it was quadruplets, I nearly fainted. She paused, taking a sip of tea. The doctor said it was extremely high risk. 4 babies, all sharing the same space, all needing to grow and develop. She told me I'd need complete bed rest, minimal stress, constant monitoring, and all I could think about was how the media would react. Thomas remembered those days, the constant photographers, the endless speculation about their relationship, the cruel comments online. They would have turned it into a circus, he said quietly. Marina nodded. I couldn't bear the thought of it. These babies deserved a chance to come into the world peacefully, without their every movement being tracked by gossip columns. I couldn't let them become another headline, another scandal. She stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a thick photo album. I documented everything, she said, placing it in front of Thomas. Every ultrasound, every milestone, every tiny moment. I wanted you to have it all someday. Thomas opened the album with trembling hands. The first page showed 4 tiny heartbeats on an ultrasound screen. As he turned the pages, he watched his children grow, from barely visible specks to distinct little beings, from Marina's growing belly to 4 tiny babies in hospital bassinets. The pregnancy was difficult, Marina continued. I spent 5 months on complete bed rest. My mother came from Singapore to help, sworn to secrecy. Every day was a battle to keep them safe, to help them grow strong enough. She showed him a photo of herself in the hospital, looking exhausted but determined. They came 2 months early. Leo was the smallest, barely 4 pounds. The doctors weren't sure he'd make it at first, but he fought hard. They all did. Thomas studied a photo of 4 tiny babies in the ICU, covered in tubes and wires. His children had fought for their lives before he even knew they existed. The thought brought tears to his eyes. I wanted to tell you so many times, Marina said softly, especially during those scary days in the hospital. But I knew if I did, nothing could have kept you away. The media would have followed, and the stress. She trailed off, shaking her head. How did you manage to hide? Thomas asked, looking at photos of the babies coming home, their first smiles, first steps, first words, all the moments he'd missed. My mother helped a lot, and I'd been preparing for months before I left, setting up this new life. The house is in my mother's name. I used cash, stayed off social media, kept to myself. The neighbors just think I'm a single mom who works from home. She pulled out another album, this one filled with more recent photos. They know all about you, she said. I tell them stories every night about their brilliant father who creates amazing things that help people. They know you didn't abandon them, that sometimes grown-ups need to do hard things to protect the people they love. Thomas looked at a drawing pinned to the refrigerator, 4 stick figures holding hands with 2 taller ones. Our family, read the childish scrawl at the bottom. Leah drew that last week, Marina said. They've always known they have a father who loves them, even if he couldn't be with them yet. I made sure of that. She reached across the table and took his hand. I know what I did was hard on you. Unfair, even. But looking at them now, healthy, happy, untouched by scandal and publicity, I can't regret my choice. They got to just be children, not tabloid fodder or social media sensations. Thomas understood, even through his pain. He thought about how the media still sometimes camped outside his house, how they turned every business decision into a personal drama, how they'd never really let go of his story. His children had deserved better than that. They're so much like you, Marina said, smiling as she showed him more photos. Leo loves puzzles. He can solve ones meant for much older kids. Lucas is fearless, always the first to try something new. Luna has your way with people. She makes friends everywhere she goes. And Lily, she laughed. Lily's already trying to reprogram her electronic toys. She's definitely her father's daughter. Through the night, they shared stories and memories, looked at photos and keepsakes. Marina had saved everything. First words, first steps, tiny shoes, and countless drawings. Thomas absorbed every detail, trying to make up for 3 years of missed moments. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Thomas made pancakes for his children. It had been 6 months since that life-changing day in the park, and his world had shifted in ways he never could have imagined. The quadruplets sat at the kitchen counter, each with their own special plate. Leo's with planets, Lucas's with dinosaurs, Luna's with butterflies, and Lily's with robots. "Daddy, make mine look like a star." Luna called out, while Lucas insisted his should be a T-Rex. Thomas smiled, carefully shaping the batter. These simple moments, he had learned, were the ones that mattered most. The transition hadn't been easy. After finding his children, Thomas had faced the challenge of merging 2 very different worlds. He bought a house just 10 minutes from Marina's, moving much of his business operations to Vancouver. Stream Connect's board had been surprisingly supportive once they understood the situation, perhaps because Thomas's newfound happiness had brought back his innovative spark. The media, predictably, had gone wild when the story broke. Tech billionaire's secret family. Quadruplet surprise. Silicon Valley's greatest love story. But this time, Thomas and Marina were prepared. They released a simple statement explaining their choices, asked for privacy, and focused on protecting their children. What surprised everyone was Catherine's response. When reporters ambushed her for a comment, she had smiled genuinely and said, "Every child deserves to be protected and loved." Marina made a brave choice, and those children are lucky to have 2 parents who would sacrifice everything for them. Her words had changed the narrative overnight. Instead of a scandal, their story became one of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Catherine's support had meant more than either Thomas or Marina expected, and it led to an unexpected friendship between the 3 adults. One Sunday afternoon, as Thomas pushed the quadruplets on the swings in their backyard, his phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. Her nonprofit was expanding its focus to include support for high-risk pregnancies, inspired by Marina's story. She wanted their help in developing a program that would provide both medical care and privacy protection for women in similar situations. "What do you think?" he asked Marina that evening after the children were asleep. They sat on the porch swing, enjoying the peaceful moment. "About working with Catherine?" Marina smiled, watching a hummingbird visit her flower garden. "I think it's perfect. Our story could help other families. And the children should see that love can take many forms, that forgiveness is possible, that families can grow in unexpected ways." The children had adapted to their new reality with the remarkable resilience of the very young. They loved having 2 houses, 2 bedrooms, 2 sets of toys. But most of all, they loved having their father in their lives. Thomas made sure to be present for everything: school drop-offs, doctor appointments, ballet lessons, soccer practice. One day, as Thomas sat helping Leo with a particularly challenging puzzle, his son looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, are you sad that Mommy didn't tell you about us before?" Thomas paused, considering how to answer. These moments of brutal honesty were common with the quadruplets, and he'd learned to meet them with equal truthfulness. "I was sad to miss your early days," he said carefully. "But I understand why Mommy made that choice. She wanted to keep you safe and give you a peaceful start in life. Sometimes love means making hard choices." Leo nodded, fitting another piece into place. "Like how you move your whole company here to be with us?" "Exactly like that." Thomas smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Some things are more important than business. The change in Thomas was noticeable to everyone who knew him. The driven, sometimes ruthless businessman had been replaced by someone more grounded, more present. He still ran Stream Connect, but his leadership style had transformed. The company's new focus on ethical AI and privacy protection was directly inspired by his personal experience. Marina had returned to work too, but on her own terms. She ran her AI research firm from a home office, developing programs that helped protect children's privacy in the digital age. The quadruplets often played in the room while she worked, their presence a constant reminder of why her work mattered. The most profound changes, though, were the quiet ones. Like the way Thomas now knew each child's unique preferences, that Luna needed her stuffed penguin to sleep, that Lucas loved stories about space, that Lily would only eat green vegetables if they were arranged in patterns, that Leo hummed when he was thinking hard about something. One evening, as the family sat in their backyard having a picnic dinner, Catherine stopped by with news about their joint project. The children ran to greet her with hugs. They called her Auntie Kay and loved her visits, especially since she always brought them small gifts that somehow perfectly matched each child's interests. "The first privacy shelter opens next month," Catherine announced, accepting a juice box from Luna. "We already have 3 expectant mothers who need help staying out of the public eye during their pregnancies." Thomas watched as Marina and Catherine discussed the project's details, marveling at how life had brought them all to this point. His former wife and current wife had formed a friendship that went beyond mere politeness, united by their shared desire to help others. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Thomas found Marina in their home office, working on her latest AI project. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Any of it?" Marina turned from her computer, considering the question. "The only thing I regret is the pain I caused you by leaving. But looking at our children, how happy and well-adjusted they are, how they've never had to deal with media pressure or public scrutiny, I know we ended up exactly where we needed to be." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. Their journey hadn't been traditional or easy, but it had led them to something real and precious. Their children were growing up surrounded by love, protected but not isolated, understanding that family could be complex and beautiful at the same time. As they walked through their home, checking on each sleeping child, Leo clutching his puzzle book, Lucas sprawled across his bed, Luna cuddling her penguin, Lolly surrounded by her beloved gadgets, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy his life had actually saved it, leading him to this moment, to these 4 magical children, to a love that was stronger for having been tested. The world might have seen their story as a sensational headline, but the truth was far simpler and far more profound. It was a story about choices and consequences, about sacrifice and redemption, about the kind of love that puts others first. Most of all, it was a story about family, not the perfect kind you see in magazines, but the real kind that grows stronger through challenges and changes.